I was screaming in the middle of the night, begging him to let me sleep, but he just laughed, turned on the lights, and said, "I'm inviting strippers over." I thought I was losing my mind. I moved into my boyfriend's house just 3 weeks ago, and what I thought would be a fresh start in our relationship has turned into a nightmare. From the moment I unpacked my last box, it's been fight after fight, but the worst of it, I can't sleep. I work 9 to 5, so I need to be up by 8ish every morning. My boyfriend doesn't have a set schedule and sleeps whenever he feels like it, sometimes at 4 a.m., sometimes at 7 a.m. Before moving in, I was in bed by 11 or 11:30 every night, no problem. But living with him, I compromised, pushing my bedtime to midnight, maybe 12:30. That wasn't enough. At first, I tried sleeping in the master bedroom, but he would come in and out all night, making noise, turning on lights, and rummaging around. I asked him to stop. I begged him to let me sleep. His response: "Just give me 10 minutes. I'll be in bed." Hours later, he's still in the kitchen or the living room, banging around. So I moved to the guest room, desperate for even a few hours of uninterrupted sleep. It doesn't have a lock, but I thought it might be enough. It wasn't. He'd come into the guest room instead, waking me up again. The breaking point came last night. I told him I had to be up early. Doctor's appointment at 8 a.m., meaning I had to wake up at 6:30. I put a note on the guest room door. "I have to be up early. Please be considerate." I set up everything I needed: eye mask, white noise fan, a sleep podcast, and was asleep by 11:30. It didn't last long. He came into the room 3 times, drunk. First, he turned on the light. Then he pulled up my eye mask. Each time I pleaded, "Please, just let me sleep." Instead, he started yelling in the hallway, laughing loudly and joking about having strippers over, even making fake sex noises. I broke. I was on the floor, crying, begging him to let me sleep. He laughed and said, I'm sorry, I was just joking, I'm a jerk." I told him I was leaving to sleep in my car. He begged me to come back, promised he'd go to bed. I gave in, went back inside. He wasn't in bed. He was in the basement doing laundry. I waited, exhausted and defeated, until he came up and started cuddling me, telling me he loved me and was sorry. I asked him to come with me to my appointment in the morning. He agreed, but when I went to the bathroom, he locked himself inside, refusing to come out. I snapped. I screamed, threw everything off the dresser, flipped the nightstand, and broke a lamp. He pushed me onto the bed, accusing me of stealing his necklace. I was terrified and promised to help him find it. After we found it, I crawled into the master bedroom alone and slept there until my alarm went off. Morning came. He noticed his front veneer was gone. He accused me of taking it. I denied it, tried to help him find it, but I had to leave for my appointment. On the way there, he texted me, "You don't care about me. Get out and leave me alone. You are one of the most selfish individuals I've ever met." I didn't respond. He called later to say he found the veneer. I came home, worked my 9 to 5 from home while he slept the day away. Tonight, I'm booking a hotel and planning to move out this weekend. I feel horrible about throwing his stuff on the floor and breaking the lamp, but after weeks of no sleep and constant disruptions, I just can't take it anymore. Update 1. After the night I left to sleep in my car, I ended up booking a hotel instead because I couldn't deal with the idea of returning home. I was drained, emotionally and physically. Just being in a quiet, clean room by myself felt unreal. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't holding back tears or walking on eggshells. I slept through the night without interruptions, and waking up rested felt like a gift I hadn't appreciated in far too long. The next morning, I knew I couldn't avoid going back to his house forever. My stuff was still there, and I needed to figure out my next steps. I drove back around 9 a.m., hoping to sneak in and out before he woke up. No such luck. The moment I walked in, I saw him on the couch in the living room. He looked up, groggy, and asked, "Where were you last night?" I told him I stayed in a hotel because I needed to sleep. Instead of acknowledging what I said, he rolled his eyes and muttered something about how I was overreacting again, before going back to his phone. That single moment made something snap in me. There was no apology, no concern for how I was feeling. He acted like my need for basic human decency was some kind of personal attack on him. I realized I couldn't do this anymore. I went straight to the guest room, grabbed a duffel bag, and started packing essentials. My plan was to move out over the weekend, but I needed to get enough stuff together to last a few nights at the hotel. He must have heard me moving around because he came in about 10 minutes later and asked, "What are you doing?" I told him flat out, "I'm leaving." He looked at me like I'd just slapped him. He said, "You're not serious, right? You're really going to leave over a couple of bad nights?" I told him it wasn't just a couple of bad nights. It was weeks of being disrespected, ignored, and treated like my needs didn't matter. He started pacing and saying things like, "This is insane," and "I can't believe you just walk away." Then, like clockwork, the guilt tripping started. He said, "I thought you loved me. I thought we were building something together." I stayed calm and told him I did love him, but love wasn't enough if he wasn't willing to meet me halfway. He asked if we could talk about it later and begged me not to go. I told him I'd already made up my mind. After that, he got angry. He said, "Fine, leave. See if I care. You're just being dramatic, like always." I didn't engage. I knew if I stayed and argued, it would just give him more opportunities to manipulate me into staying. I packed as much as I could carry, loaded up my car, and left. For the rest of the day, he bombarded me with texts. They were all over the place. Some were apologetic, others were angry. He said he'd change, he'd do better, he'd sleep in the guest room permanently. Then, minutes later, he'd accuse me of being selfish and ungrateful. I stopped responding after the first few messages. That night, I sat in my hotel room and started making a plan. I reached out to a few friends to see if anyone could help me move the rest of my stuff. One of them offered to let me crash at their place temporarily while I figured out my next steps. I didn't want to impose, but I knew I couldn't afford to stay in the hotel for too long. The next day, I went back to the house with a friend to grab more of my things. When we got there, he was sitting in the living room, looking sullen. He barely acknowledged us as we walked in, but the moment I started packing, he stood up and said, "So this is really happening?" I said yes, and he just shook his head like he couldn't believe it. As we were loading up my car, he followed us outside and said, "You're making a huge mistake. You're going to regret this." I told him I'd already made my decision and got in the car. Over the next couple of days, I went back a few more times to get the rest of my things. Each time, he'd either ignore me completely or try to guilt-trip me into staying. At one point, he even tried to block the door and said, "I'm not letting you leave until we talk this out." I told him we'd already talked about it and I wasn't going to change my mind. The last time I went back, he was surprisingly calm. He said he just wanted to say goodbye and asked if we could have one last conversation. I agreed, mostly because I wanted closure. He apologized for everything and admitted he hadn't treated me the way I deserved. He said he wished he'd realized how much he was hurting me sooner. I told him I appreciated the apology, but it didn't change anything. I needed to prioritize my own well-being, and staying in a toxic environment wasn't an option. He said he understood, but I could tell he was upset. Now, I'm staying at my friend's place while I look for a new apartment. It feels strange to be starting over, but also freeing. I don't have to tiptoe around anyone or beg for the bare minimum anymore. For the first time in weeks, I feel like I can breathe again. Update 2. The past week has been a roller coaster. I've officially moved all my stuff out of his house and I'm staying at my friend's apartment for now. It's a small space, but they've been incredibly kind, giving me room to process everything. It's strange to wake up in a place where I don't feel like I'm on edge constantly. I can finally breathe, but it doesn't mean it's been easy. After I moved out, the texts from him started up again. At first, they were apologetic. He told me he missed me and wished he had taken my complaints seriously. He said he'd realized how selfish he'd been and promised he would change if I gave him another chance. It was tempting to believe him, but I reminded myself that I've heard those promises before, and nothing ever came of them. When I didn't respond to his apologies, the tone of his messages shifted. He started calling me heartless and saying I was giving up on something that could have been amazing. He sent paragraphs about how I was the problem, how I overreacted to every little thing, and how I was too demanding. It was exhausting to read, so I stopped. I blocked his number after that because I couldn't handle the emotional whiplash anymore. Then came the social media posts. He put up vague statuses about being betrayed by the person you love most, and how some people just don't understand loyalty. I knew those were about me. Mutual friends started reaching out, asking what happened. I told them I didn't want to go into detail, but said the relationship wasn't healthy for me anymore. Most people understood, though a couple of his closer friends tried to convince me to talk to him just one more time. One of the hardest parts has been the guilt. Even though I know leaving was the right choice, I keep replaying the moments where I lost my temper or yelled at him. I keep wondering if I could have handled things differently, if there was a way to fix things without walking away. My friend has been great at reminding me that it's not all on me. They said, "It's not your job to make someone respect you, it's their job to be decent in the first place." That hit hard because I realized how much energy I wasted trying to get him to care about my needs. Therapy has been a lifesaver. I've only had one session so far, but the therapist helped me see that I wasn't crazy or overreacting. She explained how sleep deprivation and constant gaslighting can make you doubt your own reality, which is exactly how I felt. She said it'll take time to unlearn the patterns I fell into during the relationship, but the fact that I left is a huge first step. Something else that's been on my mind is how quickly I moved in with him. We'd been dating for a little over a year, and it seemed like the natural next step at the time. But looking back, there were red flags I ignored. He was always a little dismissive of my feelings, and he had this tendency to make everything about him. I thought those were just quirks I could deal with, but living with him amplified those issues to the point where I couldn't ignore them anymore. For now, I'm focusing on rebuilding my life. I've started looking for apartments, and while it's overwhelming, it's also exciting. I'm imagining a space that's entirely mine, where I can decorate however I want and set boundaries that no one will stomp all over. I've also been leaning on my friends more, which is something I didn't do enough while I was with him. It's amazing how supportive people can be when you let them in. One unexpected bright spot in all of this has been reconnecting with an old hobby, painting. I used to love it but stopped when my life got too chaotic. Now that I have time to myself, I've started picking up the brush again. It's been therapeutic to put my emotions into something creative, even if it's just splashing colors onto a canvas. He hasn't given up trying to contact me. I found out through a mutual friend that he's been asking people about me, trying to figure out where I'm staying. It's a little unsettling, but I'm trying not to let it get to me. My friend reassured me that if he shows up uninvited, they'll handle it, but I'm hoping it doesn't come to that. I know this is going to be a long journey. There are moments when I miss the good times we had and wonder if I made the right choice. But then I think about how miserable I felt in that house, how I cried on the floor that night, begging for basic respect, and I remember why I left. Every day, I feel a little stronger, a little more sure of myself. It's not easy, but for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm heading in the right direction. Update 3. It's been a few months since I left, and life has completely transformed in ways I didn't expect. I'm writing this from my new apartment, which is fully mine. It's small but cozy, and for the first time in a long time, I feel safe and at peace. The walls are painted a soft sage green, a color I love but could never have in his house, and the space is filled with little pieces of me, art I've created, plants I'm somehow managing not to kill, and cozy furniture that makes me feel at home. Leaving him was, hands down, the best decision I've ever made. At first, it felt impossible to untangle myself from the guilt, the second-guessing, and the constant what-ifs. But every day away from him made me see more clearly how toxic things really were. It wasn't just about the sleepless nights, though. That was a huge part of it. It was about the lack of respect, the emotional manipulation, and the way he made me feel like my needs were a burden. After I blocked him on everything, he tried reaching out a few more times through mutual friends. At first, they'd relay his messages, apologies, promises to change, the usual. But eventually, I told them I didn't want to hear about him anymore. Most of them respected that, though one or two tried to play the mediator role and suggested I give him another chance. I made it clear that wasn't going to happen, and over time, the messages stopped. One thing I didn't expect was how freeing it would feel to set boundaries like that. For so long, I let him, and others, honestly, walk all over me because I didn't want to seem difficult. But now I realize that standing up for myself doesn't make me difficult. It just means I value my own well-being. Therapy has been a game changer. My therapist helped me unpack so much, from the guilt I carried about leaving to the way I downplayed my own needs for so long. She pointed out that my reaction to the constant sleep deprivation, yelling, crying, and lashing out, wasn't me being crazy or dramatic, as he often claimed. It was my body and mind hitting their limit. She helped me see that his behavior wasn't just inconsiderate, it was emotionally abusive. That was a hard pill to swallow, but acknowledging it has been a crucial part of my healing. I've also reconnected with friends I drifted away from during the relationship. Looking back, I see how isolated I'd become. I spent so much time trying to manage his moods and keep the peace that I barely had energy for anyone else. Now, I'm making up for lost time. We've been going out to dinners, catching up over coffee, and just being there for each other in ways I forgot were possible. One of the biggest surprises has been how much joy I've found in being alone. Before, I thought being single would feel lonely and empty, but it's been the opposite. I love coming home to a quiet space, cooking dinner for one, and having complete control over my time. There's no one barging in at 3 a.m. or making me feel guilty for needing sleep. It's blissful. A few weeks ago, I ran into one of his friends at a coffee shop. They told me he's been struggling and that he's really sorry for how things ended. I said I hoped he was able to work on himself and left it at that. I don't wish him ill. I hope he gets the help he needs, but I've let go of any responsibility for his growth. That's on him now. As for me, I'm focusing on building the life I want. I've started volunteering at a local animal shelter on weekends, something I always wanted to do but never had time for before. I'm also taking a pottery class, which has been surprisingly therapeutic. There's something incredibly calming about molding clay with your hands and creating something tangible. Work has been going well too. I feel more focused and productive now that I'm not running on fumes all the time. My boss even commented on how much more engaged I've been lately. It's amazing what a difference consistent sleep and peace of mind can make. There are still moments when I feel a pang of sadness or nostalgia. It's hard to let go of the good memories completely, and part of me wonders if he'll ever change. But then I remind myself that it's not my job to wait around for someone to become the partner I deserve. I'm moving forward, and that feels incredibly empowering. To anyone who's stuck in a situation like I was, unsure if leaving is the right choice, I can only say this: trust your gut. If you feel like you're constantly fighting to be heard or respected, that's not love. It's survival. You deserve more than that. This chapter of my life is closed, and while it was painful, it taught me so much about myself. I'm stronger, wiser, and more in tune with what I need and deserve. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be.